Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another exciting roundtable of the European SDG Summit organized by CSR Europe. The topic of today is From Assurance to Responsible Sourcing, and we are honored to host an outstanding group of speakers that will share with us the insight on this topic. Before to start the session, just few basic information and technical details. During the webinar, all the participants will be on mute to minimize the audio noise. If you have any technical problems, please refresh the link and try to log in again. And in case you have any question, this can be shared with the panelists by using the chat function on the right side of your screen. Or after the session, you can email me at mm@csreurope.org. Without further ado, I would like now to give the floor to our moderator, Dr. Heike Schulz, Coordinator of Dry Sustainability from CSR Europe. Heike, good afternoon. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Marco. Good afternoon to all the participants of this session and good afternoon also to the audience. I'm very happy to be the moderator this afternoon and we will talk about the exciting topic from assurance to responsible sourcing, and we could also say, in other words, how can we finally create impact? How can we come to sustainable supply chains? We structured the upcoming 90 minutes in 3 parts. I will give you a short introduction in the topic, a short welcome, and then we will have a panel with participants and experts from various initiatives around sustainable supply chain management. And we will hear from them, from their experience, how it went so far in their programs. We will have, after the panel session, a Q&A session where we will add some of the Q&As that the participants can post on the chat. And at the end of the session, we will have some closing remarks with an outlook way forward as outlined through the German EU presidency, contributed by Jan Christian Niebank from the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. That's the plan for today. And if you could go to the next slide, please. I will immediately start with an input on the potential, but maybe also the limits of sector supply chain initiatives. And I will focus the insights on a study that was conducted by CSR Europe at the beginning of this month. So if we could go to the next slide, please. What is the challenge? And I listened to another session this morning, and there I found a much better description of the challenge than you can see it here on the slide. And therefore, I want to share it with you. In fact, the challenge, and that was how it was mentioned this morning, the challenge is, how can we find out who carries the burden in a global supply chain? Who really carries the burden? And what can we do? How can we organize due diligence, and how can we organize our measures in an inclusive way to make sure that we take the burden off those that suffer from human rights issues, from environmental issues or other issues towards a real system change? So that's, I think, what sustainable supply chains are aiming for. And of course, that's not an easy exercise and quite a challenge to tackle. So on the next slide, you see a summary or an overview of the mix of activities that businesses usually undertake to tackle this challenge, or at least start the path towards tackling this challenge. And the first line that you can see here, of course, companies have their individual measures on due diligence, on capacity building, their individual sustainability strategy and programs. So that's the first way towards sustainable supply chains. Usually, very often, in the meantime, nearly all the time, companies figure out, well, there is something that they can do on their own, but there's also a stage where it becomes difficult to do things on an individual level. Therefore, they get engaged in collaborative efforts. They get engaged in collaborative efforts with peers, in collaborative efforts with stakeholders within initiatives. So that's the middle layer here, engagement in collaborative efforts. And the third layer is more an institutional, even going beyond the collaborative efforts, saying to really tackle the changes, we also need concerted action within policy frameworks. So that's the set of activities, or that's the, one might also say, the toolbox of activities towards impact in supply chains. And I think we do not have the issue that we cannot agree on where we want to go to and what's the direction. We have, as you can see it here on the left-hand side, agreed frameworks that we all rely on, like the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We have the OECD guidelines, the International Labour Organization frameworks. The way towards impact is, I think, where it's worthwhile having a closer look at. And now today, we mainly talk about the layer in the middle here, engagement in collaborative efforts, and how to make this engagement as effective as possible. And we will also tackle, especially with our last part of the session, how a concerted action with policy frameworks could look like. If we could go to the next slide, please. I can introduce what we did in the study that I mentioned in the beginning at CSR Europe. We looked at 10 sector initiatives, either sector initiatives or also cross-sector initiatives. You can see the logos in the right-hand corner on the slide. And we looked at these initiatives with a framework of components that we derived from the ICEAL principles and also from a drive sustainability model. And we looked at how do these initiatives address direction and principles for their members. How does their due diligence system look like, and what are they doing in the field of capacity building? The first one, direction and principles, we looked at, for example, are there common goals defined? Are there targets defined? Is there a stakeholder involvement process included? That's what we understand when we look at direction and principles. And of course, is there a reference, for example, to these frameworks that I just mentioned, like the UN Guiding Principles or the OECD framework? The gray box due diligence system included criteria like, are there certain due diligence tools developed commonly in this initiative, like audits, self-assessment questionnaires, or whatever? How do these tools look like? And how are the results of these tools then used for decision-making in the member companies or organizations? And the third one, capacity building, includes everything regarding impact on the ground, like trainings for suppliers, projects on the ground, the inclusion of the entire supply chain, and so on. So that was the framework that we looked at, and we came to a conclusion, and that's what you will see on the next slide, that is probably not that surprising for you. So when we look at the maturity of the 10 sector supply chains that we looked at, and I have to add that was a desk research, so for sure there might be some other work to do here, but still from a first result, the maturity of these sector initiatives is very strong when we look at direction and principles. So all of them had goals defined, had a target setting process, had a stakeholder involvement process, referred to certain standards, but maturity was much less much less evident when it came to due diligence systems or capacity building. And when you go to the next slide, please, we will have a deeper look into the due diligence pillar. And I think what is very important here and very interesting, maybe also discuss in the run of our session today, why is the maturity in due diligence lower than, for example, in the policy or in the direction pillar? It is not the issue of having tools available like risk assessment, self-assessments, or audits. It is more an issue, and that's what you see here in the first line of the graph, integration of results and truthfulness. And I think that's very interesting also for those that manage sector initiatives. How can we influence decision makers within companies that are members of these initiatives, that they really integrate results in their, for example, purchasing decision making? What can we do? How can we do that? How can we measure the impact of our due diligence aspects? So one of the key stakeholders of sustainable supply chain initiatives are finally the purchasing directors and purchasing professionals in the companies that are members of these initiatives. So there is obviously still a lot to do when we look at the initiative level. And now when we go to, on the next slide, to the third pillar here, talking about capacity building, the weakest pillar, when we look at the three of them, we can see that overall the results or the maturity is not that elaborated, but especially the focus on continuous improvement, the focus on suppliers beyond tier one, and also the collaboration for impact shows some room for improvement here. Why is this? I think, and here we are back at what I said in the very beginning, do we really know who carries the burden in a supply chain? And how can we really make sure that we have an integrated approach here and go for long-term impact? And that is not so easy to tackle. And again, looking at the mix that we always talk about, here is maybe where initiatives really need also support on the legislative or political level, to further strengthen their approach. So I think that is at least a very interesting finding for those that manage these initiatives, but also for those that are part of initiatives, or maybe for companies that are still thinking of becoming a member of an initiative where clear maturity is already given, but where challenges still need to be tackled. But now we will hear from experts. Now we will hear from those that are in the middle of the work of initiatives, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you for our panel today. And the headline really is the program we want to learn from experience. Welcome to all of you. We will have on the panel Nicholas Garrett, CEO from RCS Global. We will have Michelle Brühlhardt, Executive Director from the Coppermark, Thomas van Haren, Senior Manager, Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative of the Consumer Goods Forum, Oksana Kobianskaya, Project Manager at Drive Sustainability, and Stefano Savi, Executive Director of the Global Platform for Natural Sustainable Rubber. So you see, we have a broad range of initiatives, and therefore I think we will get very interesting insights and inputs where we can learn from experience. And I would like to ask Nicholas to take over and let us know about your project on responsible sourcing collaboration and your lessons learned. Thanks a lot, Nicholas.
Thank you, Heike. That's great and a very insightful presentation that tees up quite nicely, I believe, what I have to contribute. So RCS Global, who I represent here, is really a key partner to industry. We're not only leading a responsible sourcing audit and advisory firm, but we're also an impact generating responsible sourcing action platform. Now, for us, it's really a case of impact being the currency of our generation. You know, we know we can't fail the climate. We know we have to get the energy transition right. And we also know that human rights and the environment are obviously at risk in supply chains and actions in supply chains. We also know that resilience in supply chains is obviously key in the time of the global pandemic. Now, in that context, we're also really beginning to understand the importance and I guess cost effectiveness of implementing impactful responsible sourcing. Now, for us, it was really insightful. We did a market study and that really showcased that the numbers make clear that responsible sourcing makes business sense. Now, we in our day-to-day work, we enable responsible sourcing of raw materials for the global economy, and we do so by enabling players at every tier of the global raw materials value chain to adopt and implement responsible sourcing good practice. This is really where our work in our intersectoral partnerships with industry, governments, and obviously also civil society are anchored. In our implementation, we're guided by the mantra of measurable and demonstrable continuous improvement on the back of quality data, really being the key to be kind of able to tell it, a really insightful impact story. Now, from so-called artisanal and small-scale mining sites in Africa to factories in China, we have staff physically present at really at every stage of the value chain, not just obviously working with those actors working at that specific tier of the value chain and implementing good practice, but also really generating important responsible sourcing data points. And it's actually also not me here, giving this kind of like contribution, but it's really them, who are the true, heroes in our work, because without them, none of this would be possible. Technology, in turn, just to close the loop, is for us, it's not a test tube, but it's really a proven enabler that we use in our work for more efficient data collection, analysis, and use. Now, in this context, I've brought two examples today to talk about. And the first one of that is really our EV responsible sourcing partnership. Now, together with major automotive groups and also major global battery producers like CATL, LG Chem, or Ferasis, for example, we've established transparency over the entire value chain in raw materials, and at the same time also ensure continuous improvement of sub-suppliers from mines or recyclers to the OEMs. And we do so, yes, through assessments, of course, because assessments are incredibly important to have a steady data flow, but also in combination with training and capacity efforts in good practice, and also through the continuous engagement on data integration into reporting. So your presentation on that point was really insightful and important for us. I just want to read out one statement from Volkswagen, who really described the impact the work has for them. Now, they said the cooperation with RCSs helps us to better understand which raw material sources and suppliers are in our supply chain and to measure their responsibility performance. In direct contact with our sub-suppliers, we can better explain and monitor our expectations of responsible sourcing and better follow up on agreed measures following our sustainability audits. Now, this is the head of procurement strategy at Volkswagen Group. So from us, the message is really clear. If you don't know who your suppliers and sub-suppliers are, and if you don't engage in a process of ensuring continuous improvement of your value chain, you're really failing not just responsible sourcing requirements, but you're also failing yourself because you're bypassing an opportunity to have impact in a collaborative manner through a process that has proven to work. Now, the second example that we really just briefly wanted to touch upon relates to the artisanal mining sector, where in our view, artisanal mining communities should not be viewed as a risk, but as an opportunity to support significant livelihoods while getting obviously also much needed supply of critical raw materials to the market that we need for our energy transition. So at the same time, as a collective, we feel that we have really failed the ASM sector so far with de facto embargoes or exclusions from supply chain. So what we've done is, in partnership with initially with USAID, the support of IOM, various German development corporations, and later in partnership with forward-acting OEMs like Volvo Cars and Polestar, as well as the Responsible Minerals Initiative, and obviously also the most important operators in the ASM space in cobalt and tantalum, we found a way to support and integrate this ASM sector into global supply chains responsibly. And we do so by monitoring ASM sites in gold, 3Ts, copper, and cobalt, but could really be any ASM kind of like mined raw material, as well as the trading chains for risks and impacts, and workshop monthly issued corrective action plans with local stakeholders, whilst also overseeing the implementation of the corrective actions. Government and civil society are really key partners for us in this because they ensure our work supports broader governance objectives and at the same time is also fully placed in a local context. Now, this includes obviously, state services at the local level in charge of occupational health and safety, traceability, and obviously others. At the same time, the process is not only a core component in the global responsible sourcing assurance architecture, but it's also proven to generate tangible impact, right? For example, so in cobalt, we've seen a measured reduction of risk in categories such as child labor, OHS, and workers' rights, etc. 72% of all, sorry, I can't actually see the slides here. 72% of all recommended corrective actions have been implemented compared to only 7% 2 years ago. Likewise, 100% of all risk areas that we assess and have assessed to be high or moderate have seen a reduction in risk levels. Now, these numbers really point to demonstrable continuous improvement. At the same time, and getting to a close here, is that the data we generate provides invaluable input into sector formalization and local impact initiatives, for example, in our work with UNICEF on child labor remediation. It also enables downstream companies' due diligence and local engagement, right? And in essence, with that, our program is really all about seeking out coordination and meaningful collaboration to move things forward. Now, obviously, this is also about challenges, and the wall we really need to push through is obviously for more downstream companies to engage in this impact generating program, right? ASM operators can't do this alone. Local stakeholders can't do this alone. And our program really provides a pragmatic entryway or pathway for downstream companies to get involved in regional impact. So obviously, if you're interested, do join us. Perhaps to close, because obviously my time is coming to a close here, are partnerships instant butterflies? They're absolutely not, but at the same time, they can be. So for me, it's really important to keep in mind that limited goals will give you limited action, and limited action will give you limited impact. And the key themes that are important for us to really make partnerships work are A, you need the right partners. B, you need the right sequence of scaling action. And C, you need really an unwavering commitment to see through impact, orientated actions. But I will leave those sort of last three discussion points for the discussion later, so not to monopolize the microphone. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Nicholas. Yes, maybe you can repeat your three discussion points again when we have the Q&A session. Thanks a lot. And I will, without further ado, hand over to Michelle to introduce us to the copper mark and the lessons learned there and the challenges. Michelle, welcome.
Thank you very much, Heike. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I think this sequence here flows quite nicely. And Nick's talked really well about some of the interest and challenges OEMs or other end user companies face when they need to make responsible choices in their procurement. The copper mark, and I'm not sure if we can get the slides on the screen here to give the audience a sense of who we are. Thank you. The copper mark sort of comes from the other end of the supply chain and has really been driven by the copper producers in the copper industry as a way to react to increasing expectations for responsible production. And so a few years back, the International Copper Association started the development of the copper mark, but we are a very young organization. We've actually been in existence for less than a year, in the sense that the copper mark has become its own organization outside of the industry's body back in December 2019, and is now, or has started since December 2019, a transition from what was initially an industry project to becoming a multi-stakeholder organization. I think it's really interesting to see the broader vision of the copper mark. Again, it's the intention here is very much to tie into global objectives, particularly the UN SDGs, but really also to demonstrate the industry's contribution to the SDGs, to major global agreements such as the Paris Agreement and climate change, and really making sure that we start to move the needle, not just for the leading companies in each industry, but that we are starting to bring the rest of the industry along, that we're starting to move that middle and really scale the impact and scale the changes that we're looking to achieve. On the next slide, please, if I could move on here. Because we are a relatively young organization, we had a core benefit, and I think this speaks to the amount of work that has happened in the responsible production space and in the responsible sourcing space, in that we've decided deliberately not to go out and develop a whole new copper standard. I believe everybody can already hear eyes rolling when we start to talk about yet another standard, yet another scheme that's metal specific. But instead what we said was, well, look, there is a benefit and there is really a need to engage in industry, to build that commitment, to build that engagement and understanding of the urgency of responsible practices, to bring, again, the industry actors along. But we can do so by leveraging the existing systems, by recognizing work that's already been conducted, and again, by building on what's already out there. So the copper mark has adopted the risk readiness assessment criteria from the Responsible Minerals Initiative as our core expectations for responsible practices. It's worthwhile to note that these are actually based themselves on all existing or over 40 existing best practice standards that are implemented in mineral supply chains. What that means is we're essentially taking the core expectation across all the existing voluntary standards, we're distilling that into a set of criteria that cover all major environmental, social, and governance issues. That has some obvious benefits. Again, one, we don't have to go out and develop a new standard. We can be sure that we cover the core aspects and requirements and expectations that are really out there, not just for copper, but for raw materials and minerals specifically. And secondly, it allows us also very easily to integrate what we call the equivalency element of our process. So that is, again, to recognize existing systems that are there. Because we firmly believe that if we want to scale adoption, if we want to create impact, we need to start building on what's already in place. We need to recognize where that meets the expectations, and we need to start improving where there are gaps or where there are areas or aspects that are not yet covered by these existing systems. And so one of the main tools, of course, that we have at our disposal on the next slide is the assurance process for the copper mark. And so again, what sort of inspired the development of the copper mark is a need to remain pragmatic, to remain inclusive, and to base this on recognition and continuous improvement. So we have the sort of familiar tools of self-assessment, the expectation that practices are validated on the ground at the site level through an independent third-party audit, but also a reasonable amount of time to allow companies that participate in our process to really address any gaps that are identified and then improve over time. At the moment, we have, within the first 6 months really of making this process available to copper producers, we have 11 sites that participate in the process. And we can already see that, I would say at pretty much all of them, or the vast majority of the participants, we are recognizing existing systems for some, if not all of the criteria that we have in place. So we're already operationalizing that. And as we're operationalizing equivalency, we are learning a lot in terms of understanding how do we work, not just about comparing standard requirements, but how do we really work in practice when we are leveraging different systems? How will we work on improvement measures? How do we make sure that at the end of the day, we're getting to this joint objective of improved practices? On the next slide, maybe, just a little outlook of sort of where we're going. And again, this is in the context of us really having been around for not too much time. We are now in what we call phase 1 for the copper mark. And that's a reflection of the priorities that are clearly communicated in the stakeholder consultations that we've conducted, saying, well, the highest interest is really around the production of the metal. That's where we see the biggest impact in terms of environmental impacts, potentially social impacts. And so that's the focus that we have right now. It's to make sure that the copper is responsibly produced from the mining to the refining stage. The vision, though, again, is broader, and it is really to bring the industry along. So we are working now to include other actors in the value chain for copper, including fabricators or semi-fabricators, to build a chain of custody system to better really understand some of the attributes and data that flows with the copper product itself around, for example, carbon footprints, around increasing requests to understand origin and provenance of materials, but also then, like I've mentioned, to tie this more directly to the SDG framework. And so we are developing an additional SDG concept over the next couple of years that is intended to help not just tell a story, but really provide validated information on how participants in the copper industry contribute to key SDGs that are of importance to the industry. I believe I have taken up most of my allocated time here, so I'm going to stop here, and I really look forward to the discussion later on with the panel. Thank you, Heike.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And I think you mentioned something just at the end of your presentation, your plans in really also measuring impact and measuring the contribution of the process. That might be something that we also need to discuss later in the Q&A. Thanks a lot. And I'm looking a little bit in the chat function. I have to say this in the meantime. There is nobody in the chat function, but I hope that some people are listening to us. But it feels like strange that we do not get any comments. Still, I am happy to hand over now as our next speaker on the panel Thomas van Haren, Senior Manager in the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative at the Consumer Goods Forum. So another focus, another industry sector. So please go ahead and tell us about your approach.
Sounds great, and thank you everyone for joining today. Looking forward to the conversation. So the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative, or SSCI, has been around for about 3 years. And if we go to the opening slide, we are based out of the Consumer Goods Forum. And for those of you who are not familiar with CGF, we are a industry association made up of retailers and manufacturers and service providers, focusing on a number of different issues, from forest positive, food waste, plastic waste, human rights, forced labor, as well as sustainable supply chains. And CGF, I think what makes it unique is that we're a CEO-led organization. So the CEOs of the companies that work with us all across the world sit on our board and ultimately take part in the decision making, and really drives the approach throughout our mission and our objectives. So I think that goes to a bit to what we mentioned earlier about trying to integrate some of the practices that we all try to aspire to in the operations of the company. Now, SSCI specifically, we are designed to be the benchmark of choice for third-party sustainability standards. So we focus mainly on the audits and assessments and certification programs that many of our companies use when they're looking at their supply chain. And as Michelle mentioned previously, there's a lot of different schemes out there, seemingly new ones every month that come up, and our focus is to really benchmark those programs that meet the industry expectations. And our goal is to create clear guidance for what a credible standard looks like. So in essence, creating a list of standards that our companies can rely upon when it comes to sustainable assessments and certifications and otherwise. Now, we focused initially on social aspects. We have our benchmark currently active for manufacturing and processing, and then we're currently in a public consultation phase for primary production in agriculture, and we'll also be taking a look at environment in the coming months and next year as well. So if we go to the next slide, I'll explain a little bit about how we do things. Now, everything at CGF is based on what we call our coalitions of action, and SSCI is no different. And in essence, these are companies that have signed up to be a part of SSCI, again, signed up by the CEO to really take on this issue and develop this initiative and the criteria. So we try to develop the criteria with all of these companies. We get them in the room. We try to, again, understand what topics are important to them to make, again, a credible decision based on a third-party sustainability assessment. So a lot of the topics that we discussed in the criteria, they focus on things that you would see in most companies' codes of conduct. So child labor, forced labor, discrimination, occupational health and safety, etc. And also beyond that is we really focused on developing criteria for the schemes themselves, to what makes a credible scheme and the way that they manage their program. It's not just enough to say that you cover child labor or forced labor, but you have to have the process in place, the properly trained auditors. You need to be able to report that information back on your audit report in a way that the companies can make sense of the information. And that again goes to this idea of if companies have the right information in their due diligence framework, they can take better actions on this. So for some of the issues that we focus on now in our primary production, which we're looking again for the public consultation on, things like smallholder farmers, family farms, as well as pesticide management, and really trying to set the bar for the industry expectation. Now, one of the things that we do at SSCI is that all of our criteria are available online, everybody online. And if we go to the last slide, I'll talk a little bit about our benchmarking process. It seems to be in social responsibility. It doesn't come with a self-assessment, but again, this is or a supply. We're really looking at the processes that our companies are using. We combine that with a desktop review and an office visit, again, to really try and focus on developing a relationship with a lot of the programs out there. We have a public consultation, and then ultimately the SSCI coalition provides what we call recognition to that program, and it goes into our sort of basket of standards that companies can use when they're looking for a credible third-party program. And of course, with everything, there's always continuous alignment and continuous improvement. And as we develop future editions of the SSCI criteria, we'll be looking at additional topics that may not have made it into the first round because they're not quite solidified as industry expectations, things like living wage, as well as community impacts, etc. So really focusing on helping, seeing what's out there, trying to improve that tool in the toolkit, making sure that the audits, which everybody realizes are part of that toolkit, are really sharper than they can be, and making sure that companies can make the best decisions based on the information that's given to them. So I'll stop there, and happy to answer any questions during the Q&A session as well.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Yes, I would have a question already now, but let's wait for the Q&A session. Maybe I think that was a very interesting insights into the benefit that you provide to your members with your benchmark approach, so that you provide your members with the information which standards or which schemes comply to a certain set of quality criteria. The next one on the panel is my colleague Oksana, who will introduce to you the Drive Sustainability Initiative. Oksana, go ahead.
Thank you, Heike, and many thanks for inviting me to present Drive Sustainability Initiative that I'm always very happy to do. So for those who don't know, Drive Sustainability is a global automotive partnership that is facilitated and coordinated by CSR Europe. So as I said, it is a global initiative that has been launched around 10 years ago, and that unites 11 largest OEMs, 11 automotive manufacturers that are united by the same mission to enhance sustainability in the automotive supply chain. So the partners of Drive Sustainability, they seek for a standardization and alignment of their individual approaches to supply chain sustainability, and they believe that collaboration with actors across the automotive value chain adds a lot of value to the automotive industry. Can I ask to move to the next slide, please? So this year, an important milestone has been reached by the partnership. So we published our long-term strategy that actually expanded the scope of this initiative. If in the past it was a very procurement-driven initiative, so we focused mainly on supply chain compliance and supplier capacity building. Now, after having consultations with the stakeholders and after realizing the expectations that are placed out there on the automotive industry, we decided to enhance the scope and introduce new activities. So our initiative agreed on the following 4 ambitions. So this sustainable raw materials, so that to source raw materials sustainably, then workforce well-being, aim to ensure employees in supply chains are treated well and empowered. The third one is the carbon neutrality, strive towards a carbon neutral supply chain. And the last one is circular value chain. which is promote circular use of resources in the automotive value chain. So what is the Drive sustainability approach to achieving those targets? And if I can ask to move on to the next slide. So in fact, Drive sustainability approach is, well, first of all, it's aligned with the OECD guidance for responsible business conduct. And then it is based on this ICL framework that Heike mentioned in the beginning of this panel. So the framework is divided into 3 pillars: direction, compliance, and impact. So which basically means that first we make sure that the companies within the initiative, they align on the same direction, on the same goal. Then we create a methodology, we create a way to commonly assess the risks in supply chains and manage them. And of course, last but not least, so based on the goal that was identified based on the results of this risk assessment, we find a way how to drive impacts on the ground, how to improve the industry performance in practice. And so just to add more details there, what we exactly do. So for example, if we talk about the direction pillar, there it was one of the first activities that we launched as an initiative. So we launched a common set of the guiding principles, which is a set of expectations towards the automotive suppliers on the key sustainability areas, such as human rights, environment, business ethics. And the OEMs partners of our initiative, they signed under those guiding principles, and as well as the members of the American AIG, so American Automotive Industry Action Group. Then once this criteria, once this set of expectations has been defined, what was needed is a tool how the OEMs could measure the compliance with those expectations, how the OEMs could assess if their suppliers meet those expectations or not. And that's how we arrived to the second step, which is the creation of a common self-assessment questionnaire on CSR sustainability for their automotive suppliers. And that, let's say, has become one of our flagship tools, and that is currently used by all the automotive partners in Drive sustainability. And if we need to talk about there, what's important to mention is, of course, face-to-face training. So every year, the partners of Drive sustainability defines, and we actually holders also into common capacity building. What can be included is the local network in China. So all that helps to drive the activities and to achieve a common leverage in the value chain. And before I stop, just maybe a last closing remark. What are the success factors of this initiative? Well, first, I think what was done well right from the start is that we had a very strategic start. So we started with a small group of companies, a small group of buyers. So it's an only buyer-driven initiative. And then within those group, we actually worked only with the procurement function. So again, we didn't align, we didn't seek for alignment with the corporate sustainability departments. We work with procurement, where the actual decisions that impactful decisions are happening. And then, of course, at the same time, while we work with the purchasing officers, it was important for us to ensure that there is a buy-in within these companies, so that the senior management of our partners is aware of our initiative, is aware of this added value. And that's why we every 2 years we held a leadership assembly, where we invited all the top management of those companies here in Brussels, and we aligned with them. We agreed with them on all the major strategic objectives of this initiative. So those are very, very important factors for our success. And the third factor, of course, is stakeholder engagement. So we periodically, very often, organized stakeholder events, especially when it comes to all the strategic decisions that we needed to take. For example, the strategy decision, the new strategy launch, that was really influenced by our key stakeholders. So again, we organized an event. We gathered all the relevant stakeholders in Brussels. We engaged them in the conversation on what is missing in our scope, how we can do better as an initiative. And that's why that was the primary reason why, in fact, as I said earlier, that our scope was expanded. So I think that would be it from my side. Thank you for having me again, and I will give the floor back to you, Heike.
Thanks a lot, Oksana. And I think the last topic that you mentioned, perfect introduction to go ahead. And welcome.
Thank you. I get a few words about the work we do at the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber, or GPSNR. So I guess to start, since rubber is a bit of a new kid, natural rubber, if we can go to the next slide, is a commodity that is derived from the it is in Thailand, yeah. And it's a commodity that is produced in very, very large scale by smallholders. Yeah, so 85% of the production of natural rubber comes from smallholder farmers. So that's very much of the global volume of natural rubber, but it's also very interesting to see that it comes from 6 to 7 million smallholders, each of them having farms that are about 1 to 2 hectares in size, so very, very small. It's also interesting to understand that about 70% of this production of natural rubber goes basically into one product, that is tires. Yeah, the rest of 30% is utilized in a plethora of other products, but the majority goes into tires. And the key issues linked to rubber are linked to the growing demand that rubber has, yeah, and the fact that the demand for rubber is growing, but the prices are very much fluctuating for this commodity. This is because of different factors, such as climate-related factors, speculation, or other issues linked, for example, to the variation of price of slightly substitutable products to natural rubber, such as synthetic rubber, for example. So what this causes is actually that in moments of very high prices, there's a willingness to expand production that causes pressure many times on forests, yeah, And in moments of very low prices, as it has been in the last few years, we see that the biggest issue we have in natural rubber is actually maintaining livelihoods of farmers. Yeah. So it's for this reason that in about 2 years ago now, at the end of 2018, a group of 11 tire makers forming a CEO-led group called the Tire Industries Project thought of kickstarting the initiative that we see today being GPSNR. And if we can go to the next slide, we can see that in the 20 months or so since the inception of GPSNR with the first General Assembly in March 2019, we have now grown to a group of 90 plus members that are covering all of the supply chain actors coming from the producers, processors, and traders, both at large producers level, but also with representation from smallholders now that have a dedicated category, a membership category in the ordinary members of GPSNR with 28 representatives from 7 different countries, but also tire makers, car makers, and other downstream users and civil society members, all coming together on a truly multi-stakeholder effort towards our vision of a fair, equitable, and environmentally sound natural rubber value chain. I think it's very important to also note that since the beginning, we've had the privilege of having with us a few important affiliate members of GPSNR, both from the associations side, but also from the academia side. And I think academia has played an important and fundamental role in setting the basis of the work of the organization. So if you can go to the next slide. The work of GPSNR is driven and has been driven so far by working groups that are very much members driven. Yeah, the secretariat of GPSNR is very small. We're just 4 people, so most of the work is done by members, for members. And at the beginning, we started with 2 working groups that are the ones that you see on the left of the screen. We had a smallholder representation working group. At the beginning, we had no smallholders in GPSNR, so we thought that it was important to make sure that anything and everything that we create was co-created towards together with smallholders. And this group had the challenge and opportunity to get smallholders involved in the organization. And we looked at the strategy and objectives of the platform, where we looked at the theory of change, so the strategy of GPSNR, by really having members to agree on what is the desired state for natural rubber that members would like to achieve, and understanding what are the gaps between the current state of the natural rubber supply chain and that desired state. And this is how we identified 3 key strategies to implement that gave birth to the 3 working groups that you see on the right side of the screen instead. One, our policy toolbox working group, that is has been tasked to identify policies that are policy guidance that companies and members along different steps in the supply chain will need to implement to ensure that their producing and sourcing and policies are in line with the overall goals of GPSNR. We have a capacity building working group that has been looking at how members can pool resources together to improve capacity building in the production countries. So especially around good agricultural practices, income diversification for farmers, and access to good planting material, as well as a traceability and transparency working group that has been working on identifying tools for transparency, such as satellite mapping tools and traceability tools that can help bring resources together again from the different members in view of having better transparency and better traceability in the natural rubber supply chain. So next slide. So at the moment, after about a year plus of work, We now have agreed GPSNR policy components for companies. And this means that company members in GPSNR, which represent about 50% of the global traded volume of natural rubber, will in the next 6 to 12 months have to modify their current policies or create new policies to be in compliance with these policy components, both on their production and sourcing of natural rubber. And we are now working on the next step. After setting strong supply chain goals, on working on taking effective action, shared responsibility principles to ensure that the burden is shared and to ensure there's an equitable distribution of GPSNR members. We also have now worked on for GPSNR, where despite being standards that are specific to natural rubber and the wheel, and really make sure that we can leverage on existing initiatives, assembly, FSC and BFC, also to our assurance, and we understand how to put some more countries from the more both which we plan to launch on the first quarter next year, dedicated to start this platform to with up 21. And I've tried to be brief. I know we were a bit out of time. I hope I've helped you, Heike, there, and we can have some more time for the Q&A if there are any more questions. But I'll share the link to the policy components in the chat if people are interested to having a look at where we are.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Very interesting presentation, very interesting also because we heard about the involvement of all stakeholders in the sustainable rubber supply chain. I'm now looking at the chat function because we are now in our Q&A session. So far, I think all the questions that were dedicated to one of you are already answered individually. I would like to wrap it therefore up now what we heard. And I think it was very interesting because we have 5 very different initiatives on the panel here. So we have 2 initiatives, at least that's how I would kind of cluster it. Drive Sustainability and the Consumer Goods Forum, driven by the producing companies, driven from the upstream end of the supply chain, driven by the member companies. We have the Sustainable GPSNR, Sustainable Rubber Initiative, that was, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong, Stefano, that was initially driven by the tire makers. So those rather in the middle of a supply chain, when we look at it from an OEM perspective at least, that now developed a multi-stakeholder initiative or became a multi-stakeholder initiative. And of course, we have the copper mark and also the initiatives that were presented by Nicholas coming from the downstream angle in the mining sector and offering certification schemes or offering processes in the mining sector. So very difficult, I think, angles to look at the collaboration point of view. Now, when I think of my slides that I presented in the very beginning, I would have 2 questions, or one question to Thomas and also to Oksana, because of course we saw. Obviously, the critical part of due diligence measures is how are they implemented in decision-making processes in member companies. And maybe, Thomas, if I can ask you first, you showed us the slide with all your members, and you also explained that the CEOs committed to the activities. How can you measure your impact in terms of decision-making at your companies, at your member companies? Do you do that? What would you need to be able to do this?
Sure. So one of the things with coalitions of action at CGF is that we have coalition commitments, and in part for SSCI, it's the commitment to incorporate the SSCI into the responsible sourcing practices and policies wherever possible, but also to have the discussion on what due diligence looks like, where do we want to go when we look at things beyond the audit framework, beyond certifications, etc. And that's at least particular to SSCI. In terms of, we have other coalitions, such as our Coalition to End Forced Labor, that's taking a look at own operations. So how do we implement human rights due diligence strategies in own operations? And they're putting together a framework to exactly measure that. I think the question's still open, and part of it will depend also on what comes out of the EU in terms of the mandatory due diligence. But how do we best approach this from an own operation standpoint? So we try to make those commitments, and as I said, because the CEOs sign up for these coalitions, that helps us get that internal buy-in and really make sure that we can get impact with the people that need to make the right decisions.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. Yeah, and you already mentioned it. I did not expect that there is a solution yet, because that's not an easy one, but that might probably lead us to the third pillar of the mix, the concerted action, also with policy frameworks that might support this. Oksana, from your point of view, do you already have an answer, or is there still a way to go in terms of decision-making in drive member companies?
Well, thank you, Heike. Yes, indeed, it is a challenge. So from our perspective, what we observe in Drive is that, yes, for example, if we look at the SAQ of the tool that we co-created, so yes, there has been a drive from our members to create the tool, and they all were committed, interested to use it. But then how the results are integrated, it's something where it is really difficult to align, and it, in the end of the day, it remains an individual decision of a company on what they do with the results. And it is fine, provided that the tool is used and it serves its purpose, and there is let's say an alignment on the criteria. But when it comes to more practical actions, when it comes to impact part, that's where it gets more tricky, because this is the pillar where, in fact, an alignment is necessary, because you, in the end of the day, you need to select one project that you should agree to go for, and let's say common approach is necessary there. So you cannot anymore to become a single player in the field. So indeed, I do not have an answer, but it is one of the challenges that we have to go through.
Thanks a lot. Anybody else from the panelists is, of course, always welcome to contribute if there are any contributions, how to foster the impact within organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Heike. Just, I guess from our perspective, a really important one is that you act cross-functionally, and that you get the ears and the attention of obviously board members that are responsible for different parts of the business. Obviously, there's an integration here of procurement, of sustainability, of marketing. Your responsible sourcing performance can do wonders to your brand value, right? If you build a brand value strategy around it, but the brand value strategy isn't isn't necessarily driven through the procurement department, right? So you need to have that cross-functional thinking and acting within the company. That has worked very well for us. At the same time, what our observation has also been that the leaders in the industry, particularly within the automotive OEMs that we work with, there is a keen interest of understanding what the others are doing and how do you compare to your peers. So obviously here it comes in the importance of having a leader that sets a new benchmark, the interest in the rest of the OEMs and understanding kind of like what good that has done to that company, and if it is demonstrable for them to also follow. So those have been our experiences and processes that have been working very well.
Thanks, Nicholas. Stefano, I mean, we hear it's already not that easy to work together with actors within one stakeholder group. You even handle actors from different stakeholder groups coming towards impact on the ground. What are your lessons learned? Where do you see the challenges?
Oh, that's a good question. I think is that to achieve sustainability, you need to have broad collaboration at some stage. Yeah. So you can have different strategies to achieve that. You can decide to have a few people working on a fast-paced strategy and then have a product that is more easily designed, but then you have to sell it to the others, right? Or you can co-design your product with everyone, and that takes a longer time, but there's no one that you have to sell it to because everyone has designed it. Yeah, and that's the approach that we're trying to take. Yeah, with GPSNR. I don't think it's there's a silver arrow. I guess these initiatives always depend on the people you have on board. At the end of the day, yeah, you can have a group of very enthusiastic people and have a very different result with the same strategies, same tactics, same policies than if you had a group of not so committed people, and that's sometimes very, very personal. And we see this in our everyday work. Yeah, we have a normal distribution of success, I guess, in what we do, and I guess that's the same for everyone. But what I think is really telling of what we're doing is that I've seen that whenever we empower members to be creating the actions, there's much more ownership of what is being done, and that has led to a lot of success for us in the past year. What I can say is that if I take the example of rubber and the work that we've done, we've started late. There were some initiatives that were trying to have a similar impact on rubber, but by empowering members to do that, really, I think in a year and more or less a year plus, we've managed to get 50% of the market volume to agree to the same set of policy components and have a clear target. And I think that will enable us to really move towards implementation and monitoring of our work in a much speedier way now that we've done so.
Okay, thank you. Michelle, you mentioned in your presentation that you are working on an impact measurement towards the development goals, if I got it correctly. That might also maybe help us to measure the impact of collaborative initiatives. Can you maybe tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, so again, indeed, we are in early stages in how exactly that will work to the UN SDGs, and to really be able to have that as our inspiration and guiding framework. I think all assurance schemes at the end of the day are facing this challenge of how do you then demonstrate impact on the ground. We've mentioned this a number of times on this panel. An audit itself isn't going to change practices, right? An audit is a tool in your toolbox to understand practices and performance at a certain time and place. And
it's interesting
gives you a confidence, but we really need to move beyond verification of actors and to start building the practices that we're looking for. And so we see the link to the SDGs and the concept that we will be developing over the next two years or so as an addition in this toolbox to really help us understand, not just in a verification of today's practices, but over time, how do we tie into these broader goals that governments have agreed to, that we have globally agreed as societies will be working towards, and really start to try and make this in a measurable way that we can have confidence we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah, if we would have more time, I think it would really be interesting to learn a bit more here, or to exchange how this can be done. But looking at the timing, I think I have to go back to the presentation again to make sure we also benefit from the input from Jan Christian Niebank. So if we could have a look at the presentation now, please, again. At least I don't see it, but no worries, because we heard, at least in a nutshell now, how initiatives work, what initiatives do to avoid redundancies, to reach out, to have impact on the ground, but where initiatives also struggle a bit. And we also heard that there are first ideas how to measure impact, and also how to measure impact, for example, in corporate decision making. But there are, I think, there is the need for more collaboration on the ground, because again, at least I remember what was said this morning, we always have to have in mind who's suffering in the supply chain, where is the burden, and how can we, from a long-term perspective, really have a systematic change altogether, so that the burden is not there anymore in the end. So how can we here also come up with concerted action from a policy point of view? And therefore, Jan Christian, thank you very much for being here today with us and for contributing with some closing remarks from the point of view of the Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs in Germany. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Heike, for the kind invitation. And it's a great pleasure to be part of this important workshop and roundtable. I would also like to thank you for the insightful presentations. I really learned a lot already. As you know, the protection of human rights and the enforcement of decent work along global supply chains is a priority of the German presidency of the Council of the European Union. And we have recently had a digital conference. And on October 6th and 7th, we had discussions with European guests from politics, civil society, the social partners, and companies to generate momentum for a European action plan. And the message of this conference was very clear, that the time to act is now, and that there is a growing consensus that the EU and its member states must really take a decisive action and also require companies to respect human rights and decent work.
Excellent.
The situation for millions of rights holders in global supply chains still remains unacceptable. And the situation has worsened through the COVID-19 pandemic. And it has also shown that resilience and building back better is impossible without sustainable supply chain management. We still have 150 million children that are forced to work, more than 400 million victims of forced labor and sexual exploitation, nearly 2.8 million people that die each year of work-related accidents, and around 374 million that suffer from work-related illnesses. So this really shows the urgency that the time to act is now. And the EU, of course, has a special responsibility because it's a community of shared values, but also as the largest internal market in the world and with a share of 15% of all global imports. Unfortunately, almost 10 years after the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles, only a minority of businesses undertakes comprehensive human rights due diligence along the entire supply chain. And especially those companies with cross-sector activities are confronted with different EU sustainability criteria, different due diligence requirements, and also very heterogeneous national legislation. So without, I think this shows very clearly, without a coherent EU strategy and with voluntary measures alone, we will not be able to significantly change the way that businesses manage their human rights risks. And more needs to be done to have a common understanding of due diligence requirements across sectors, size of businesses, and countries. So what we advocate for during our presidency is a more strategic, coherent, and integrated approach. And during the next month of our presidency, we want to encourage the Commission to continue the path taken and give impetus for renewed and ambitious strategy. We aim to adopt Council conclusions in the Employment Council at the beginning of December, advocating for an EU action plan on human rights and decent work. So what are the priorities for us in this action plan? First, it's important, of course, to fight child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking. And we would also like to see EU quality criteria for national action plans. And a huge issue, of course, is how to improve access to effective remedy for victims of human rights violations. But today, I really want to focus on two key issues, which are of particular importance. First of all, the need for European human rights due diligence standard, and then the need for European sector dialogues. And I think both topics are, of course, very closely linked. I really think it's impossible to talk about one without mentioning the other. What we need is really a smart mix. So we need to require companies to rights due diligence through binding measures, but at the same time, of course, we need measures to support, enable, and incentivize business respect for human rights. The topic of mandatory due diligence, for us, it should be a cornerstone of EU action. And we believe that companies would really benefit from it through harmonized requirements, through more legal certainty and fair competition. And of course, it would have the potential to improve the situation for millions of rights holders along global supply chains. This is why we strongly support the initiative by Commissioner Reinders, who said he would propose a legislative act by 2020. And we're really glad to see that we're no longer discussing if there should be legislation, but rather that we are now looking at the how of legislation. So what should it look like in our opinion? We believe that it should cover all human rights and all economic sectors and the entire supply chain. I think it's also important that the lower tiers of the supply chain are not neglected and that supply chains are really being made transparent so that responsibility can also be assumed beyond direct contractual partners. For this legislation not to be toothless, it would have to cover more than only a few large corporations, in our opinion. And failure to comply with the due diligence requirements should have consequences. So those affected should be able to enforce their rights in courts. Finally, of course, it's key for us that we have regulation that is manageable for businesses. So it's crucial that it is proportionate, that it creates legal certainty, and in particular that it takes into account the needs of SMEs. And we could also imagine that there are incentives for companies to cooperate more closely and join sector initiatives and pool their expertise. And this brings me to the second key issue, which is, of course, also the center of today's discussion, European sector dialogues. I want to emphasize that the trend towards mandatory due diligence does not diminish the importance of sector dialogues. Quite the contrary. We believe that any regulatory framework needs to be complemented by using the engagement and leverage of sector-wide cooperation. We need to enable enterprises to exert due diligence in their supply chains. In particular, we believe that SMEs need sector-specific support, and the combined market power of an entire European sector really has the potential to bring about improvements. And we believe that's something that national dialogues alone would not be able to achieve. I know my time is probably also running up already. I just want to mention a few key aspects. What should European sector dialogues look like, in our opinion? They should have an agreed purpose, of course. They should have a clear roadmap and practical, achievable deliverables. It's crucial that a multi-stakeholder approach is taken. So civil society needs to be involved, social partners, local stakeholders like farmers and communities in mining areas. And another aspect that also resonates with the study by CSR Europe, which you presented, Heike, is to prioritize impact-oriented collaborative action. And of course, when we talk about European sector dialogues, we believe it's important to cover all 5 elements of human rights due diligence and not just single out one. So it should cover everything from policy statements to the effectiveness of grievance mechanisms. Another important issue is to enhance local capacity building for long-term impact, and also to cover cross-cutting issues. I just want to mention living wages as an example. To sum up, I really believe there's a great potential in European sector dialogues, which so far hasn't been exploited yet. And this is why I would like to encourage everyone to join forces for a new generation of European sector dialogues. And yeah, I'm convinced that this is how we can really increase leverage and create additional impact. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jan Christian. Are there any questions? I'm looking at the chat, but I don't think so. Any questions from the other panelists to Jan Christian? If not, and also looking at the timing, I think we have to stop here. I would love to further discuss, because I heard that a lot of us and you here are working on criteria for sector dialogues, be it on the European level, be it on the individual level. We are all within our individual initiatives working on criteria, how to measure impact. Maybe this is something that we or someone or somehow also should focus on in next steps, because I think that is then also leading towards more impact. Because, I mean, first we have to measure what we mean by impact, or we have to define how we want to measure it. And only then we can further work on really having more impact on the ground in the end. I think that is would be something that would be very interesting to discuss further. Also, maybe to discuss what do initiatives need for more impact on the ground, and yeah, how we could work together. But what we achieved today, I think, from my point of view, we learned from each other. It was also for me very interesting to hear what you do, how you work, where are your main activities in the different initiatives. And I thank you very much for being very open also about your challenges, about the lessons learned, and about your experiences. Thanks for to all of you, and I hope you will also join other sessions of the still ongoing European SDG Summit. Feel free to look into other sessions, and thanks a lot. And I think now the session will be closed. Correct, Marco?
Yes, correct. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice evening or afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.